The letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians, from which our second lesson was taken tonight, is not the easiest book of the Bible to get a handle on. In part, this is because it might not be a letter, nor written by St. Paul, nor posted to Ephesus. The challenge of reading Ephesians flows from it being a highly generic document. It's not obviously responding to a specific problem in a local church, as we get elsewhere in the New Testament. There are no words of comfort for a community facing persecution, no theological polemic to correct a dodgy preacher. Secondly, not all early manuscripts of this document list Ephesus as the intended destination. With this omission, the opening verse simply addresses saints who are faithful in Christ Jesus. Such Christians could have been anywhere. Next, while the document begins and ends like a letter, these sections are brief compared to other epistles. Are they purely stylistic? In addition, the meat of the document looks more like a theological tract than a letter. And finally, although Ephesians contains some concepts which are redolent of the teaching of St. Paul, because the contents are so generic, there is no knock-dead argument to prove it was written by the great missionary apostle. Putting all of this together, some New Testament scholars are rather snooty about Ephesians. They say that it is derivative and pseudonymous, attributed to St. Paul, but more likely the output of a follower. Now, to us in the 21st century, this looks like wicked plagiarism. But back in the ancient world, claiming the authority of a big name like Paul would have been commonplace and acceptable. Pseudonymous writing was considered a style of respect, from a student to a master, an acknowledgement of the teacher's spiritual and intellectual inspiration. Whatever the circumstances of this document, and I will keep calling it Ephesians, I'm not going to dismiss it as bland because we don't know who wrote it or where it was headed. Because the flip side of the accusation that Ephesians is rootless is that it might actually have widespread relevance, including to you and to me. It clearly ranks alongside the rest of the New Testament as a Christian document from the first century, and it was evidently valued by the earliest believers, presumably because they appreciated its message. Might we do the same? Tonight's verses, which Maggie read for us from chapter 4, pick up just after the middle of Ephesians. Chapters 1 to 3 are about theology, God blessing humanity through Jesus, the salvation which he brings, and the calling of all nations to put their trust in him. The second half of Ephesians, in chapters 4 to 6, tilt towards the practical consequences of this theology, in particular the implications of salvation for how Christians should treat one another. And so the second half of Ephesians is not about how Christians should live in the world, so much as their attitude towards those within their own community of faith. In summary, this means unity in diversity. As we heard in verse 5, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, within which Christ has poured down diverse gifts on us all. Verse 7. The writer goes on to talk about the different ministries which are given by God to the church. Verse 11. And in verses 15 and 16, he likens the result to Paul's metaphor of the human corpus, the complementarity of many organs within a single organization, the church being a body of which Christ is the head. It is this complexity of the church which leads the author in Ephesians 4:1-2 to exhort his audience to pursue three particular qualities. As we heard, I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Humility, gentleness, and patience. Three fundamentals for ongoing unity. Humility is a word which will not have landed well with the mainly Gentile audience of Ephesians. Humility to Greeks carried a derogatory sense of servility. But the emphasis in tonight's reading is more that we should not be domineering, but we should not seek to impose our presence or opinions on others. This sort of humility is about avoiding the envy which can corrupt our shared life. It doesn't mean that we should put ourselves down or make ourselves vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. Rather, humility in this passage is about Christians recognizing the existence of other Christians, and that despite our differences, we share a common heritage. Ephesians next proceeds to commend gentleness. Elsewhere in the New Testament, this word and its cognates carry connotations of meekness, as in, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew chapter 5. But in Ephesians 4, the intention is less passive than meekness. Gentleness here is a positive quality that Christians are called to inhabit and to exercise. Gentleness, a virtue which does not seek to avoid conflict by turning a blind eye to that which is wrong. Gentleness, a word used elsewhere in Galatians 5, among the fruits of God's Spirit. Thirdly, humility and gentleness are accompanied by patience. Patience, a word which is used in the Old Testament to describe God's mercy towards wayward humanity. God in the Old Testament is patient because she is not easily angered. Such a quality is necessary within any community. Those who possess and display patience do not increase bitterness, and its exercise should dissipate tensions. Paul includes patience as an aspect of love in the famous 13th chapter of his letter to the Corinthians. And elsewhere he lists it as another of those fruits of the Spirit. Yesterday was the feast of the Confession of St. Peter. Next Saturday, January the 25th, is the feast of the conversion of Paul. These two festivals bookend the week of prayer for Christian unity, days when churches are called to remember what we share with other denominations, in this country and abroad, all part of a single rich tapestry. As the writer to the Ephesians knew, unity does not mean uniformity or unambiguity. Rather, unity is a quality which characterizes people of difference who occupied a shared locality or organization, whether that's congregations or wider collectives. A unity like this is not just for Ephesus or wherever tonight's lesson was first read. Such a unity is for us all. And humility, gentleness, and patience are virtues for which we should pray and exercise as we seek to maintain such unity in diversity within the bond of peace.